Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English A, and our objective now this hour is to introduce a series of observations on the great English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, C-H-A-U-C-E-R, and his classic series of stories called Canterbury Tales, T-A-L-E-S. Don't confuse that with the thing that sits behind a donkey. We won't get into it. We'll have some observations now about who this Chaucer cat is and why he's so important. Now watch this on my whiteboard. If I go to the whiteboard real quickly and I do this little timeline thingy, remember how we do this where we put a 0 here as the birth of Christ? We talk about events which occur before the Common Era. We talk about events as Common Era, correct? So, for example, we sit out here in 2013. We call this the 21st century, correct? Right? We put, for example, here Columbus sails the ocean blue in what? 1492. Remember, we kind of play. We get to play that type of game, right? What we want to do right now on the timeline is the first date we want to remind ourselves of is 1000 Common Era. That will be Beowulf. All right? That will be Beowulf, the epic poem that we just finished studying. Now, if you flip in your notes back one page to page 138, 139, and right under Geoffrey Chaucer, you see the word Geoffrey Chaucer, you will see some dates there. Now, I recommend a rough date to help you remember this. Let's call it, shall we, 1350. Okay? Let's call it 1350. And you can kind of see the proximity then to 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue and all of that, right? Okay? So if we're talking 1350, what century are we talking? Well, we're in 2013 now. That's the number 20, and we're in the 21st century, correct? So if it's 1350, we're in what century? We go up, don't we? So it's the 14th century, right? So by the 14th century, what's the big deal? Well, if you will remember, when we go back in time, just a week or so ago, to that packet on Beowulf, page 1, and you remember that we had Mr. Keeley trying to read those funky words to us? Remember that? And you remember that I said that we were actually looking at English, right? But it's what we call Old English, okay? Now we are prepared to look at the next major step in the development of the English language, what we will call, for your notes, Middle English. Chaucer's English is what we would call Middle English, okay? And his contributions in this regards are monumental, for reasons we'll kind of explain. Let's talk about this cat, Chaucer, and why he's a big deal. Chaucer is, professionally, he's what we today would call an ambassador of sorts. He travels around representing England, okay? Comes from the city of London. While he's traveling, he's influenced by two really important kind of moments in literary history. The first has to do with a series of stories told by a cat named Boccaccio. Boccaccio. Now, Boccaccio is Italian. He writes a series of stories that he calls the Decameron. Deca meaning 10. 10 stories. These stories are framed to ask you to imagine that there is a plague in one of the cities of Italy. To escape the plague, a group of Italian young men and women, all under the age of 25, run outside of the city and quarantine themselves in this little place outside of the city. Because they're Italians and they're under the age of 25, they engage in any number of activities that we shan't speak of in detail now. But after they grow tired of that, they decide to kind of pass the time by telling stories. Boccaccio relates what those stories are, and dare I say it, most of those stories are fairly controversial even today. They're pretty much just straight up pornography. But he's Italian, so you know. Now, the thing that makes Boccaccio so important is that Boccaccio followed a poet named Dante, and he wrote in the Italian language of the common person, not in the Italian language of the upper class. When Chaucer gets off the boat in Florence, the Decameron is a huge hit. Chaucer begins to formulate an idea to do something very similar, but he's going to do it back in England, where he's going to put together a collection of stories, okay, And he's going to publish these stories for the intention of making money. Okay? So Chaucer's influenced by this Italian named Boccaccio. By the way, put a note to yourself at 3A that you will read the one safe story from Decameron. It's called Federico's Falcon. I just mentioned it in our master schedule review. It's called The Falcon, or Federico's Falcon, and you'll be reading it in about 14 days. You're responsible for it, okay? So it's in your hymnal later. Now, let's just imagine for a moment that Mr. Giudice there woke up this morning and he had this just burning interest to find out what the people of England in 1350 were like. That's just the way he's hardwired. And he realizes that probably the local library here ain't going to get the job done, so he jumps on his private jet. He flies to Washington, D.C. You didn't know about this, but he does have, you know. And there in D.C., he goes to the greatest library in the history of all of the world, with the exception of the Alexandrian Library, and that is, of course, the Library of Congress. And he walks into the great library there, and he walks up to the circulation agent in the front of the room. He says, look, I got to know what the people in England in 1350 were like. Interestingly, the matriculation agent there will say, there's not a lot to read. I basically can only kind of introduce you to 3 different places you can go to find out what people in 1350 in England were like. The first are the church people, the priests. They write in a language we call Latin. And Judy says, that's no worry, I have a PhD in theology and I can read in Latin, so just give the text to me. And when Giudice reads these texts, he's going to basically hear 2 things about these people of 1350. One, they smell. They don't take baths, and I mean this literally. They don't take baths. They can go for years without ever taking any kind of shower. Here's why. They actually believe that if you wash off that coat of dirt on you, you get sick and die. Remember, 1350, we got serious plagues happening all over England and Europe, right? And so they're very suspicious about anything that would lead to their illness. Ironically, they think wiping off the dirt can make them susceptible to germs and dying. So they can go for literal years without ever showering, without ever. And the church people say when they get inside of a church building for mass, they stink badly. Second thing, they are always hanky-panking. These people of 1350, always hanky-panking like rabbits they are. All the time. The church people will say, we preach against hanky-panking, does not matter. All they think about is sex, and all they do is hanky-panky all the time. They're having children all the time. Of course, it kind of makes sense that if you've got plagues coming through wiping out the population, right? It's a matter literally of trying to repopulate, and hanky-panking is the way that happens. We won't get into that later. Frederick, maybe later.
How would you? They're disgusting.
The second, yeah, right. The second group, Giudice comes back to the circulation agent at the Library of Congress and says, okay, dude, I get it. They smell and they hanky-panky a lot, but I need to know kind of more than that about them. Like, for example, what did they wear? What was fashion? What, you know, etc. She says, well, the second place you can go are to the French. The French run the show politically. They have the power in England in the time. And they write in French, though, to which Mr. Giudice says, no worries. I also have a PhD from the Sorbonne, and I speak fluent French. Give me those texts. Those texts report the following. 1, they stink. As the French officials say, they stink. Yeah, they literally do stink. They don't ever shower. And number 2, they smell. Are you ready for this? They smell when they talk. Now, what does that mean? We're not talking about the fact that they like garlic and stuff like that. What we mean here is they have, not bad breath. What they mean here when they say this is they speak a different language than the great language of French. They speak a strange language, which is a hybrid language. It kind of comes together from multiple strands, and it has a very strange sound to it. It sounds kind of like German. For those of you who have ever been in an airport or whatever, and you heard Italian speaking or French speaking or even Spanish spoken, and you're like listening and you didn't know what they were saying, but you were like, that just sounds really cool. See, the French will say, of course it sounds cool, because that's a melodic language. It's what we call, of course, the Romance languages. The language of Italian or French or Spanish just kind of rolls off of the tongue. But when you hear German spoken, it sounds like you got some kind of hairball stuck in the back of your throat you're trying to get out. And these French will say the same thing about this language that these guys are speaking. That is a street language. The French will say they speak it on the streets when they don't want us to know what they're talking about. It's almost like subterfuge. It's almost like it's a secret code language, and the French say we don't like it. They'll do it all the time in a marketplace. It is a spoken predominantly, not written language. Okay? There's no dictionary for this language. There's no orthography, spelling. There's no spelling yet for this language. It is predominantly a spoken language. Well, Judice comes back and he says, I get it, they smell, and they hanky-panky, and they smell when they talk. But I'd really like to know more about them. The agent will say, you know, about the only other place you can go is Chaucer. He's going to be the only cat that really can tell you much about what these people of 1350 were like. Who is Chaucer? Again, he's this guy that travels around and does this work as an ambassador. But ultimately, he ends up working above one of the gates of London. The way he got into London was through their gates. And he works there. For a long time, he works with these people that are speaking this language that we will call now English. Okay? When Chaucer decides to write his group of stories, he has a monumental decision to make. What language will I write in? He spoke multiple languages. For example, he could have written this in Italian and kind of competed with Boccaccio's and Boccaccio's Decameron. But he wanted to write something in England. He could have written it in Latin because he knew he was going to go after the church and kind of attack them. But the only problem is the only people that can speak and read in Latin are church officials. And he kind of wanted to mess around on them and jack on them. And so obviously there's a problem. Really important. So important. Are you ready for this for your notes? That we call Chaucer the father of the English language. No kidding. Chaucer writes in this spoken language of English. So, for example, we'll come back to Mr. Keeley. Before he was trying to read Old English, and he did an adequate attempt, right? But he himself had to admit there's not a whole lot of the words that he was reading that he could comprehend. We'll see how well he does now with Chaucer's English that we will call Middle English. Go ahead and go to your little handout there. And do you see where I've written the words general prologue, Mr. Keeley? Do you see the word whan, T-W-H-A-N? Mr. Keeley's now going to attempt to read English for us of Chaucer's day. Go ahead, Mr. Keeley.
One not able with his Chaucer suit the dark guts of March had proceed to the roots and bathed every vein and switch, the core of which good virtue engagender is the flower.
Go ahead and give him a hand again. He did a fine job on the attempt. Well done, Mr. Keeley. Well done. Now, let's point out for just a second, right, Mr. Nelson? Several of these words he's reading, we can kind of figure out. For example, whan, W-H-A-N, is actually our word when. Right. So all of a sudden, this starts to look a whole lot closer, right, to the English we're familiar with. By the way, one more time, back to your whiteboard and the notes on your board there. If you'll do this real quickly and write 1600 and put a circle around it, you can see the difference in the dates. About 300 years before Beowulf comes Chaucer. After Beowulf comes Chaucer. And about 300 years later, this is Shakespeare, okay? And when you as a freshman read Romeo and Juliet, right? Two households both alike in dignity and fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, right? That's the actual language of Shakespeare. That we will call, by 1600, we will call that modern English. No kidding. So the English language historically begins at roughly 1000 with Beowulf and culminates 600 years later with Shakespeare. Right in the middle is the most important, believe it or not, writer we will ever read if we're reading in English. No kidding. He gets this kind of press. Why? Because Chaucer wrote in English. Now, if you look on page 140, you will see what Mr. Keeley was lumbering through in translation. All right, so we're still working in translation. By the way, are you ready for this? This tells you a little bit of the difference in now and then. When I first started lecturing at Worland High School, what you're reading with Mr. Keeley was the page out of the textbook that we used. we actually read the Middle English of Chaucer. Believe it or not, Mr. Keeley, after about an hour or two of working with this language, you actually start to figure it out because the orthography is different. The spelling is, he will spell the same word 3 different ways because there's no Webster's dictionary to tell him otherwise. He basically spells the words the way they sounded by the people who were speaking the words. If you look on page 140, you'll see in translation what Mr. Keeley was working with. When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such powers, brings about the engendering of the flower. When also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales in the air in every grove and heath upon the tender shoots, and the young sun is half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye. So nature pricks them and their heart engages, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far off saints hallowed in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they wend to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give them help to them when they were sick. So when we're looking now, we're reading that as English. And of course that, I mean, some of you will say, dude, that still is kind of difficult poetry to comprehend. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible, all right? So we'll have our agenda now set before us. Tomorrow when you come back, write this in your day planner. Tomorrow when you come back, the ambition for you is to have read up through, what we say, page what? Whatever it is, try to get through 164, all right? Finally, put it in your day planner. I've been asked by the annual staff for you to come up and pick up these 2 sheets of paper. Your job is to have these filled out, okay? And back